Welcome to A House Divided, coming to you live from Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. If it's on our shelves, it's history. My name is Bjorn Skaptason, and we are back live to talk to you again, talk to a new author again about a new, just released Civil War book that I think you're really going to love. Anyway, yes, we are here at Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago, and we are going to talk with David Powell. David is the author of all sorts of great books, but his newest book is, I'm going to show it to you here, The Atlanta Campaign, Volume 1, Dalton to Cassville, May 1 to 19, 1864. I'll just hold it up for the camera right there. Now, before we get into this book, though, I want to introduce everybody out there to David Powell. David is an historian and he's a writer, he's a graduate of the Virginia Military Institute. Previously, the author of the Chickamauga Campaign, a 3-volume history of the Chickamauga Campaign, the maps of Chickamauga, Failure in the Saddle, an analysis of the cavalry campaigns during the Chickamauga Campaign. And then after that, David, probably a lot of other stuff. But yeah,
I mentioned at the top of the program, Dr. Albert Castell's really excellent book on the Atlanta Campaign, Decision in the West. It came out in 1992. It's a 1-volume history of a 112-day event. So, of necessity, Dr. Castell had to shorten some things, had to truncate some coverage. And yet, it's still an extremely worthwhile book. I will be recommending it to people when I publish Volume 5, because it is still, I'm finding it to be very insightful. That said, I wanted to accomplish a couple of different things with, first of all, I wanted to expand that coverage and cover the things like Resaca that Dr. Castell simply didn't have the time and the space for. I wanted to give a full coverage to some of the military operations in June before Kennesaw Mountain. Some of those operations that get covered in a paragraph. That's in Volume 2. Obviously, it's been almost 30 years. Since it was almost 30 years since I started writing. It's been more than 30 years of publication since this book came out. But I wanted to update the scholarship. There's been a fair amount of new stuff and new interpretations and new thoughts on Atlanta, so I thought I'd add in the new thinking on that.
have you had other scholars that have been valuable in helping you?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
There's a sort of a group of hardcore Atlanta fans. Robert Jenkins, who lives in Dalton, just published a book strictly on Cassville, May 19.
Yeah.
Offered some really valuable insights in his own research.
Yeah, he's written some other great books too.
Yes, he has.
I want you to buy this book.
Yes.
But yeah, Robert Jenkins is one of the great
and so
writers on Atlanta.
I've worked with Bob quite a bit. We're friends. We go down and visit battlefields together. So I wanted to bring some of that new scholarship into the campaign history. And then really the third objective is just marveling at how many really good sources, how many good letters, diaries, memoirs, how much good material written by the men and in some cases the women themselves left us with that don't get used, don't get mentioned. And
there's been a revolution in primary sources because of digital research. And Castell never could have gathered everything you used. He couldn't have even gotten them. Yeah.
So the ability to sort of let the participants speak for themselves to a certain extent is in the book too. Yeah. And integrate all of that into a full narrative campaign.
Yeah, you were on describing Sherman's lieutenants here.
Yes, Sherman inherits the command of the military division of the Mississippi from Ulysses S. Grant, who's pulled east to Washington in March 1864. Sherman kind of doesn't want Grant to go. He doesn't want to break up the team. And also there's just a hint of a possibility that maybe he doesn't want to take sole responsibility for the campaign. And yet, when Grant goes, Sherman steps up. There's no question that he's going to command, and he is going to use armies drawn from the 3 departments that he now commands. The Department of the Cumberland, the Department of the Ohio, and Grant and Sherman's old department, the Department of the Mississippi. And so, because of personnel changes and roster changes, he has 3 immediate subordinates. He's going to have 3 field armies. This is going to be, in some ways, the most complicated military field organization of the entire Civil War. Sherman is going to command the Army of the Cumberland under George H. Thomas of about 65,000 men. He's going to command the Army of the Tennessee, formerly his army, formerly Grant's army, now led by Major General James B. McPherson of about 25,000 men. And then he has a very small field force, really only a single infantry corps of about 10,000 troops, the 23rd Corps, which is also known as the Army of the Ohio, commanded by Major General John M. Schofield. And McPherson and Schofield are younger. Thomas is older. Thomas and Sherman are contemporaries, whereas McPherson and Schofield have graduated from West Point in the late 1850s, and they're junior to not only not only Grant and Sherman, but also many of the men in their own armies. And Sherman's going to operate them as separate armies. He's not going to put all of this force under George Thomas. There are going to be certain issues with swapping out command. Sherman favors McPherson. Both Sherman and Grant and even Henry Halleck back in Washington are all fans of McPherson. And so that is how that is really how McPherson ends up with his job. Even McPherson is surprised when he's promoted. He says, to his mother, he says, I have no idea in the world why I'm a major general. But as a rule, the 3 armies and army commanders are going to work reasonably well together. The other major challenge is logistics. And this is, Sherman is an interesting character. He's a Civil War general who doesn't like to fight battles. He doesn't like the uncertainty of combat. He has not done well tactically in several battles. Other generals will look on him a little bit askance at times, certainly at the Battle of Chattanooga in November 1864. The performance of Sherman and his army of the Tennessee troops was questioned by the other armies, certainly by the Army of the Cumberland. But what Sherman is going to focus on, to the extent of all else, and he understands going in, is that as long as he can keep his army supplied and on the move, he has a tremendous advantage over the Confederacy. And so his logistics come first. And the story of the logistics through this entire campaign becomes a sub-story of the entire campaign. It's a story I address in periodic points.
Right. And then let's look at the other side of the coin, because you also have a triumvirate of problems amongst the Confederates. In fact, my note here was I want to ask you about Davis and his misfits. But you when you introduce the Confederate command, you do something that you don't really have to do with the Union command, because Abraham Lincoln stays pretty far above the fray.
Right.
But Jefferson Davis is front and center in the strategic decisions of his army. So when you introduce Joseph Johnston's army, Jefferson Davis and Braxton Bragg are important characters.
Absolutely. Davis, former United States Secretary of War, and as the only wartime president of the Confederacy, is really focused on the military side of the house. Abraham Lincoln sort of comes in and out of that role over time. Sometimes he has a greater hand in it, sometimes a lesser hand. By 1864, he's just stepped back. It's Grant's show now, as far as he's concerned. That's not the case with Jefferson Davis. Davis and Johnson have known each other of old. They have sort of evolved into a feuding, unfortunate relationship. They neither trust the other, and they also have very different strategic visions. And the third player in this is Braxton Bragg, who is the man who commanded the Confederate Army, the Army of Tennessee, for a year and a half in 1862 and 1863, until he lost the Battle of Chattanooga and offered his resignation, and it was accepted. But instead of being sidelined, Braxton Bragg goes to Richmond and becomes Davis's military advisor. And there is clearly a lingering resentment over the fact that even though he resigned, he probably didn't expect that resignation to be accepted. And so now he resents Johnson in command of what he regards as his old army. Johnson is a defensive-oriented general. He as opposed to both Bragg and Davis, who firmly believe in the offensive. Their beau ideal of a soldier is Robert E. Lee, and there's probably no more offensive-minded general in the entire conflict than Robert E. Lee. And they want Johnston to take the offensive, often very unrealistically, urging him to cross the mountains of East Tennessee, move into Middle Tennessee, move into Kentucky. They have strategic debates about how best to deal with the coming, what everybody understands will be the coming spring offensives of the Union armies in the East, and in Jefferson Davis's and Johnson's case, in the West against Sherman. And so Johnson and Bragg are constantly pushing for offensive warfare. Johnson very correctly understands that his logistics and his military strength don't support that kind of warfare. He can't supply his army over the mountains and get it into Middle Tennessee in any condition to fight a battle. His army would come apart because they can't forage and they can't feed. So as a result, this debate is never resolved. Johnson says, Sherman is going to mass a huge force against me, you should reinforce me. Davis and Bragg say, well, we'll reinforce you if you agree to take the offensive. Johnson replies that, well, why don't you reinforce me? I'll fall back, we'll weaken Sherman, we'll defeat him on our own turf, and then I can take the offensive. And the answer is no, if we reinforce you, you have to take the offensive. This debate is never resolved. It begins December 26th when Johnson gets to Dalton, Georgia, and assumes command. There's a letter from Davis waiting for him. They're still having this same debate on May 2nd, 1864, when Sherman's troops begin to move out towards Ringgold and begin the campaign.
Right. Hey, let's take a look for a second here. Okay, there's a copy of Narrative of Military Operations. This is the memoir of Joseph Johnston. And the things you're talking about, he will discuss in depth in this, unless he's decided that he wants to fight Sherman again over and over and over again. Now, what I want to talk about next could take up an entire hour. Okay. So please do your best at editing it. But when Joseph E. Johnston tells us that his army is small and Sherman's army is great big and he needs to be reinforced or he cannot fight, do you trust the numbers? Because once you start unpacking these numbers, every new piece of information starts making Joseph Johnston look less and less like he's honestly reporting his numbers. For instance, on the day the campaign starts, his cavalry is feeding their horses in the rear, so he doesn't count his cavalry when he reports his numbers. Now, as soon as the horses arrive, add, what, 8 or 10,000
Correct.
guys. And then also Confederates don't count officers when they... So give me your idea about Johnston counting his numbers and how he uses that, if he uses that as an excuse to act or not act.
The numbers game.
The numbers game, exactly.
It is very complicated. Typically, the Confederates like to report something called effectives, which is enlisted soldiers with muskets in the ranks. They don't count officers. They don't count, supernumeraries.
Staff,
right.
Commissary, quartermaster, stuff like that.
The Union Army usually counts numbers present for duty. PFD is an abbreviation I use in my writing. The present for duty number it counts those officers, counts some detached men, but it's usually the best standard for how many men are available to project combat power on any given day. And then the other number that's usually very important, much more important to armies or to generals commanding armies, is aggregate present, because that's the number of men you have to feed. And even if Johnson claims he has, at Dalton he has 43,000 effectives, his present for duty numbers are really 55,000 men, and that 55,000 counts those cavalry you mentioned. Mm-hmm. And then his aggregate present is about 65,000 men. So, and when Sherman begins the campaign, he uses 110,000 men, but that's not present for duty because the Federals are also using different numbers sometimes. Sherman has devised his own category called effectives. It's not the same as the Confederate category. Very frustrating.
Indeed.
It's actually higher than present for duty, slightly. So Sherman, for instance, says he begins the campaign with 110,000 men. 98,000 of them are available for quote-unquote offensive purposes. The Confederate numbers are rising because they are receiving reinforcements. Those long-delayed reinforcements that we talked about start coming from Mississippi. Got to give a shout out to a man who rarely gets a Civil War shout out, Leonidas Polk, usually reviled in Civil War roundtable circles. But when Polk is ordered to take as many troops as he feels he can spare from Mississippi to reinforce Johnson, Polk does a very effective and important thing. He takes all of his infantry and a very strong cavalry division, almost 20,000 men. And so Johnson's numbers are rising through the first volume of this campaign. It covers May 1 to 19. Sherman's numbers begin at a large number and then sort of steadily decline as he has to leave men behind in garrisons and of course, combat casualties.
Right. And so we could go on about the numbers game, but the thing that I think is important for people who are reading your book and understanding this, or reading Johnston, reading the memoirs, Johnston will tell you that Sherman has 110,000 and he has 40,000.
Right.
Which is true for about 10 minutes on the 1st of May, 1864. By the time anybody shoots a gun at anybody else in this campaign, Johnson's army has been increased by a third.
Yeah, the best.
Am I right about that?
Yeah, the best ratio, I think, of troops. By the time we talk about the Battle of Resaca, May 14 and 15, 1864, the Confederates have somewhere just north of 60,000 troops, and Sherman has about 90 to 95,000 available troops, really closer to 90,000. He's already had to leave garrisons in certain places. So that number, 110 to 40, that's almost 3 to 1.
Yeah.
90 to 60 or 95 to 65, now that's a much different ratio, much different odds ratio.
Yeah. And projecting into the future, there are going to be some battles in July where Johnston will still insist that Sherman has a 3 to 1 odds, where we're looking much closer to 1 to 1. I mean, it's never quite even. It's never going to get quite even. But to say, for Johnston to continue to say in July that Sherman outnumbers him 3 to 1 is where it starts to get beyond belief.
Yes. Just to give you one quick sense, when this book ends, when Volume 1 ends, the next phase of the campaign is the crossing of the Etowah River, which begins on May 22nd. Sherman says he has about 85,000 troops available to cross the Etowah River. By then, Johnson's army is about 75,000 men.
Yeah.
So very close in numbers.
Mm-hmm. Now, so this gets us to the armies. It gets us through the numbers, but we haven't moved. Nobody's moved out of their camp yet.
Nobody's pulled a trigger.
Nobody's pulled a trigger. So let's talk about this first phase that's going to be covered in your first volume of the Atlanta campaign. What would Sherman like to accomplish? He's now going to be the actor, and we know he's going to be the actor, and Johnston's going to be the reactor. So what is Sherman going to try to do now that his guys are actually marching?
Well, Sherman's first plan is foiled by his own lack of numbers. He wants to send the entire Army of the Tennessee to a place called Rome, Georgia, which is about 30 to 40 miles south of the Confederate stronghold at Dalton. And from Rome, the Federal armies would basically march across northern Alabama, seize Rome, and then it's a 20-mile move to cut the Western and Atlantic Railroad, which is Johnson's lifeline. Well, the Red River campaign and other instances interfere, so Sherman shortens that objective, and he moves closer to home, as it were, and he looks at the next two railroad depots south of Dalton, and he comes to Resaca. Dalton is surrounded by mountains, most notably Rocky Face Ridge on the west side. And then Horn Mountain and Johns Mountain extend that further south. But there's a gap called Snake Creek Gap. And at this point, any Civil War nerd who hasn't heard of Snake Creek Gap, I'd be astounded.
Right.
But the idea is to send McPherson and 23,000 men through Snake Creek Gap, a quick lunge towards Resaca. They then would sit on Johnson's railroad lifeline and force Johnson to retreat, and Sherman feels that would allow him to trap Johnson, or at least catch him on the move and defeat him in detail.
Yeah. Let's, since we're on that, I want to come back and talk about Dalton in a minute.
Sure.
But since we've gone to Snake Creek Gap, and since I want to share our artifacts with people, you've already seen our original copy of Johnston's memoirs. Here's a carte de visite, a photograph. For those at home, if you're not familiar with Civil War photography, the 1860s, 1850s, and 1860s were the beginning, the first time people could ever reproduce photographs in mass production. In other words, put them on paper and hand them out. Before that, there are other types of technologies, the daguerreotype and so on and so forth, that would create you a one-off piece. So now we have the ability to have photographs, and the way photographs were universally understood at the time, with very few exceptions, which makes them very valuable now, the bigger ones, it's the carte de visite, the visiting card, a little trading card size photograph. And if you get into Civil War photography and you start looking at portraits of soldiers, 98% of what you find will be this medium, a carte de visite. And so here is a CDV, a carte de visite. I'm going to lean right on in. Lean right on in so you can see it. There's James Birdsey McPherson. James B. McPherson, an original CDV. It's a CDV from life, which means on the back you can see the photographer's mark. Morse's Gallery of the Cumberland, Nashville, Tennessee. There's the guy. There's the guy that couldn't believe he was a general. But we've gotten him to Snake Creek Gap, Dave. And so could you describe for everybody what happens to McPherson once he gets his Army of the Tennessee to Snake Creek Gap?
Some would say he undergoes a crisis of confidence. I don't think he does. He gets to Snake Creek Gap. He moves through the gap on May 8th, and on May 9th he moves the 8 or 10 miles across the valley to the valley on the other side of the mountain to Resaca. And he finds that Resaca is defended by 5,000 or 6,000 Confederate troops. He because he's crossed this long distance of the valley, he's had to drop off troops to guard his flanks. And so he has about 10 or 12,000 men opposing those 6,000 Confederates. But he stops and he examines Resaca, and then on the afternoon of May 9th, he decides that he has to fall back to the mouth of Snake Creek Gap and fortify because he's not strong enough to attack Resaca itself. Now, this is perfectly in keeping with Sherman's orders. Sherman's orders to McPherson are for the Army of the Tennessee to move through Snake Creek Gap, move somewhere at Resaca or just north of it, cut the railroad, and then fall back and fortify at the gap. Both generals are worried that Johnson at Dalton will have a much quicker movement south than Sherman can reinforce McPherson. Johnson has the railroad and two good roads that are essentially a straight line of about 10 miles, whereas it's a march of 25 or 30 miles for the Union troops up at Dalton to come around, go through Snake Creek Gap themselves and reinforce McPherson. So McPherson follows his orders and does exactly what Sherman told him to do. Sherman, in the meantime, has sort of, in his own mind, changed the objective. He tells a Union officer back in Nashville, who's essentially in command of his rear area, that McPherson has seized Resaca, and he brags to George Thomas that I've got Joe Johnson dead. He bursts in at dinner once he gets McPherson's dispatch of that afternoon. I've got Joe Johnson dead. It's only much later that he finds out that McPherson, in fact, retreats. And over the next 3 days, when Sherman and McPherson get back together, when Sherman visits McPherson finally down there outside of Resaca, Sherman will admit that he did exactly what he was ordered to do, but he also says that he missed the opportunity of a lifetime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Sherman essentially criticizes McPherson for not violating his orders.
Correct.
But I also, just to push back a little bit, I think Sherman would like his subordinates to act with some independence.
Absolutely. I mean, there's definitely a time and place on a battlefield for initiative and for, when you're that far out of contact with your senior officers, you have to use your own initiative. You can't simply wait on the next little decision. Okay, should I advance? We'll wait 6 hours to find out. You can't do that. Or in this case, more like 12, because it's a round trip to get word back and forth. That said, Sherman doesn't ever really tell McPherson that, and he never tries to inform McPherson beforehand that he's sort of mentally changed the objective, and he also has made no immediate arrangements to reinforce McPherson. In other words, no federal troops, say the Union 20th Corps, which was closest, were moved on May 9th down to Snake Creek Gap in case McPherson needed reinforcements. McPherson probably would have felt a lot more confident if there was another Union Corps within half a day's march instead of a day and a half's march.
Right.
And so Sherman didn't do some of the things that he should have done, I think, to set up success. And so it's certainly on McPherson, but it's also on Sherman.
Yeah, yeah. Now, one of the really fun things about discussing the Snake Creek Gap operations or controversy or whatever it is, we are about 12 miles away from where the actual armies are in conflict, which is at Dalton.
Correct.
And one of the things that has to have, in my opinion, Sherman and McPherson scared is the strength of Johnston's position at Dalton. The idea that he could probably hold that with a fraction of his force and then send the rest of his guys down to Resaca and attack McPherson. So what's happening at Dalton? What is Sherman, or Thomas in this case, trying to do to get through?
Well, I think it's fair to say Sherman, because Sherman remains at Dalton pretty much through the entire operation and is in direct coordination with Thomas and the other Army commander, Schofield. They approach Rocky Face Ridge, which is this big, long, 20-mile long ridge, about, 1,500 feet above, and it rises very abruptly.
Have you gone there?
Yes. The top of the ridge is a knife edge.
Okay.
It's 15 feet wide. You can't march a company abreast in line, let alone a regiment. And they look at Rocky Face and all the Confederate entrenchments and the Confederate artillery positions. And even if they can get across Rocky Face on the northern end, because Sherman or Johnson can't defend the whole thing, they will then be in an open valley, and once again they'll be separated by a mountain. That means that it's going to delay them moving back and forth across the mountain. So Sherman is very reluctant to move east of Rocky Face, even north of Dalton, even north of Johnson's position. And the Confederates have spent the first week of May just fortifying, digging lines of entrenchments with headlogs, with abattis. The defenses at Dalton are some of the strongest any Federals have ever seen. A week later, when events finally do force Johnson to retreat and abandon Dalton, men of the Fourth Corps will march through, and there are a number of letters marveling at the strength of those defenses, both along Rocky Face and east of it. So it's very intimidating. There is a fair amount of fighting. One Union brigade does get up on the spine of Rocky Face and starts working its way south. The key gap is called Mill Creek Gap, and it's the most accessible passage through the ridge. But the Confederates have dammed Mill Creek, and so there's extensive wetlands and swamps and even lakes, ponds that really prohibit their ability to advance into the gap. Not that they want to go in anyway. I think General Tom Wood, the division commander in the Fourth Corps, calls it the Gate of Hell. They see it as a very intimidating place.
Right, because this Rocky Face Ridge, even in the gaps, is, like you say, it's a knife edge if you walk up and down it, but it's also bare stone. It's cliffs if you try to come up the side, which some of the Union troops have to try to do, right?
Yeah, there's an attempt to force a secondary gap at a place called Doug Gap. It's a little battlefield park today, so you can actually go get a really good look at the terrain. And these are, this is the Union 20th Corps, Geary's division, old Union 12th Corps guys from Gettysburg. So you see many of your familiar Gettysburg names there. And they lose about 350 casualties trying to force this gap against just a handful of Confederate defenders and suffer very badly.
Yeah, the Confederates can roll rocks down on them if they want. And they do.
And do.
Which brings us to, this is combat, this is fighting, but it brings us to the first full battle in the Atlanta campaign. And again, as I said at the beginning, this is the first time there have been in-depth looks at battles, and you're still writing a campaign history. Correct me if I'm wrong, but we're still waiting for a single monograph book called The Battle of Resaca that is fulsome. I remember Phil Sechrist wrote something back in the 90s, but it's a standalone battle. It would. If you compare it to any other battle in the Civil War, and it's large and it's bloody and a lot happens. So, starting on the 13th of May, McPherson in Snake Creek Gap gets his reinforcements, and Sherman is there, and they move out, and suddenly now we have the first two commanders that don't seem to like to fight are going to be forced to fight each other. So get us to Resaca. Tell us. I love the fact that this is, people watching this may just be, wow, this is a great big battle. I've never heard of the Battle of Resaca.
It's a footnote, really.
Yeah.
But it is a very large conflict, if you think about it. There's about 80,000 Federals and about 60,000 Confederates, so we're talking 140,000 combatants. So it stacks up with any number of very large Civil War battles. It's fought over the course of 2 days. The Federals do most of the attacking. The 23rd Corps sort of makes the first attack on May 14th and does very poorly. Suffers about 1,000 casualties to absolutely no result. It's also interesting because we have this accepted wisdom that Joe Johnson won't attack. He doesn't attack. He just defends and retreats. And yet on May 14th, on May 14th and May 15th, Johnson authorizes Hood to launch counterattacks.
Yeah.
So there are two really Corps-sized counterattack efforts by Joe Johnson initiated on succeeding days. Neither of them, for a variety of reasons, work that well. Partly that's the terrain, partly that's, I think, to a certain extent, Hood's fault. He's a new Corps commander. John Bell Hood this is his first sort of real combat as a Corps commander. And he has a little trouble coordinating the two divisions that he chooses to use for these counterattacks. And yet, it should be noted that right out of the gate, Joe Johnson starts throwing a couple of punches, which we're told in history never happened. So,
right. Yeah, and I think Johnson does want to fight.
Yeah.
I think there's a different. I think he would probably draw a distinction between strategy and tactics.
Yes.
He doesn't want to. He wants to create the perfect battlefield, and then he'll attack. But when he's in a battle, he sends Hood twice.
Yes.
Tries to send Hood around there, and still keeps his eye on other opportunities.
And he takes a sizable risk at Resaca. Resaca is on the north side of the Oostenaula River. The Confederates form a sort of a fortified bridgehead of about 3 miles. It runs north-south and then turns east. The Oostenaula is formed by 2 smaller rivers that converge right at Resaca. And so it's basically a fortified line between some of those rivers. And yet, further downstream, further to the west, it's about, from Resaca along the banks of the river, it's about 25 miles as the river winds to Rome. And the Union can cross the Oostenaula River somewhere between Resaca and Rome and do the same thing they did at Snake Creek Gap, i.e. outflank Joe Johnson, move against his rail line in his rear. So Johnson remains north of the Oostenaula for a couple of days. Sherman even remarks at one point that he expects Johnson to retreat because why would you fight north of the river like this? Why would you do that? And so Johnson's taking a sizable risk, and it really is finally when the Union 16th Corps crosses at Lay's Ferry for the second time on May 15th, and they cross and stay this time. That Johnson says, okay, we've got to go.
Right. Have you been to you've been to the Resaca battlefield? Does it help
Yes.
to walk around and see the nature of that valley, Camp Creek and all the rest?
Yes, it does. The state of Georgia owns 900 acres in Camp Creek Valley, just west of Interstate 75. And it's managed by the county, and it's a little battlefield park. It's open pretty much every day in the summer, weekends in the off-season. And it's well worth going to. There are other parts of the Battle of Resaca that are partially preserved or preserved by the Battlefield Trust, some in private hands with preservation easements on it, things like that. But the best part of it, really the best sense you can get of the battlefield at Resaca right there in Camp Creek Valley is well preserved.
Right. And I guess the next one thing to know about the Battle of Resaca is it is possibly due to the geography, it's a really unusual Civil War battle. Most Civil War soldiers will tell you in their, if you read their memoirs or whatever, that I couldn't tell you what happened in the battle because I can't see more than,
Right.
a few feet to the right or the left or the front. At Resaca, both armies face each other on a range of hills with a valley between them, and thousands of soldiers can see the whole battle, unfolding in front of them,
Yes.
even if they're not the person doing the fighting. What did you find when they got to writing, when the soldiers got to writing about this battle, that the things that they were able to tell you that they might not be able to tell you about another, like Chickamauga, where they're all in the woods and you're never going to see anything?
Yeah, there's a Resaca, first battle of the campaign, so there's a huge primary source data dump on the battle, composed. Jonesboro is at the end of the very end of the campaign, much less information. But many soldiers talked about the views and how it looked, how it felt. They were fighting across Camp Creek Valley, which was largely open farmland for several hundred yards. The hills were wooded, but they did have great vistas. And so there's just some great descriptions of things.
Yeah.
Now, it is difficult, rugged terrain, hilly terrain. So maneuvering troops to try and approach Camp Creek Valley was difficult for some troops. One of the problems with the 23rd Corps I mentioned was that as they're shaking out as a combat organization, trying to get all of this, they come into position initially in the wrong place. And one division actually, poor Jacob Cox, our author of that original 1890s history, is at one point spends several hours trying to reposition his troops to get in the right spot. And other corps, the 4th Corps, will accuse him of being lost, which he's very upset about, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
So it's fairly rugged in terms of hills. There are some great view sheds. There's still some great view sheds. You can go there today and see for 1,000, 1,500 yards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not what you would call a lost battlefield.
No.
It's a great battlefield that just happens to have I-75 running right down the middle of it.
Right. One of the myths about Resaca was that I-75 destroyed all the Confederate earthworks, and so it wasn't worth saving. Well, that's not true. I-75 destroyed one very important feature, which was a Confederate artillery fort. But by and large, the interstate runs behind the Confederate line. And so most of those works are still there.
Yeah.
And it's still a relatively rural place. There's a giant truck stop there, but
At the Battle of the Flying J.
but the preservation opportunities are really still tremendous at Resaca.
Yeah. Well, anyway, you're gonna want to read the book in order to get all the details of the Battle of Resaca, but suffice to say, as we said when we were going to introduce this part of our conversation, it's a big battle, and there are other battles of the same size that have 2 or 3 full scholarly monographs on it, and this one is just getting discovered. And as you found it writing it, being at the beginning of the campaign, the soldiers were very eager to write about it.
Yes.
And even the commanders were trying to keep up with their duties of writing reports. Later, that's going to get difficult. But let's move across Camp Creek, or the Oostenaula River. The 16th Corps gets across, and then what happens that Johnston decides he needs to get out of there?
He decides he has to retreat, and so he pulls off what really amounts to the second masterful retreat. Whatever else we can say about Johnson, when the Army of Tennessee retreats, it does so in a well-organized, highly effective manner. And so when Johnson retreated out of Dalton on May 12th, he was largely gone before the Federals knew it. When he decides that he has to retreat from Resaca on May 15th, once again, even though he literally has his back to a river, he gets away unscathed. The Federals are only aware finally at the end. Ironically, one of the things that alerts the Federals that they're retreating is that right at the Resaca depot, there are some military stores that they just can't evacuate. They don't have time to evacuate, and so they set them alight. And all of a sudden, there's this giant blaze that lights up everything. And so the men of the 15th Corps, who are closest to the depot and can see 900 yards away, suddenly go, aha. And so there is a little bit of skirmish fighting, but Johnson gets away clean. You know, it's really an extraordinary military operation. It's very tough to do, and he does it very well.
Right. Exactly why Sherman was wondering, why would he fight me here? Because it would be so hard for him to get away if he decides he has to do it. But then he succeeded.
Campaign history.
And then what's the next volume?
Volume 2 will cover basically the end of May. I call it New Hope Church to Kennesaw. It will end with the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain. I'm writing it now. I'm just about to assault Kennesaw, so we're almost done with it. Then Volume 3.
It rains a lot.
Oh, yes. Yes, that's. You get the sense that you're waterlogged when you're reading everybody's journals. Volume 3 will cover basically the crossing of the Chattahoochee River up to the Battle of Peachtree Creek on July 20. It will end there so that Volume 4 can cover the battles of Atlanta and Ezra Church, July 22 and 28. Trying to put all three of those battles in one volume, I think, while they all sort of hang together thematically in terms of Hood's fight for the campaign, putting them in a single volume is impractical.
That would be a huge book.
Yeah.
And all three of those battles could have a standalone.
And do
have
have standalone books.
Yeah.
In some cases, multiple. And then the final volume will cover the cavalry operations, the Battle of Jonesboro. And then each volume will have its appropriate sort of sideshows and rear area echelon operations. Right.
And engineering will be a fun read, especially what Sherman is able to accomplish in the rear areas. Anyway, that's all the time we have. We've gone over, but thank you for indulging us. No, and I'm glad that we got so that the folks at home could hear what you had to say about the books. And my apologies to those at home that couldn't hear before. Hey, we're out of time today. Our next episode of House Divided, we will have John Grinspan join us, and he has a wonderful new book called Wide Awake, and that will be August 23rd. August 23rd, when the Democratic National Convention is in town. We won't be down there. We will be up here talking with John Grinspan about the Wide Awakes, about political conventions. A different Chicago political convention. Anyway, thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you, David, very much for coming up here. If you're watching this, you can still order the book. We have plenty of signed first edition copies. Congratulations on that. And congratulations to Savas Beatty Publishers, and thank you to them for publishing the book and helping Dave get with us today. Once again, thank you very much for joining us on A House Divided, and we will see you right here next time.